This video is part of a series of 16 presentations by Crystal Whitten, PhD, based on her book, Country Living. See the video description for availability. The free videos can be found as parts 361 to 376 at www.preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com.
Today's topic is spiritual preparation for country living, and it's based on a book that I wrote during COVID. It's called Country Living, and it's available at Amazon if anyone's interested. But a lot of what we're covering in these 5 seminars comes out of this book. The theme for this series of meetings is Psalms 91, and it is one of my favorite chapters in the Bible, and I'm not going to read it right now, but it is something that I think we do need to dwell on as much as possible. So, why do we exist? I guess that's a question most of us have at some time contemplated. Most people, unfortunately, do not feel motivated to know Christ. And they have no internal driving desire other than their hedonistic tendencies. And this is true of the Christian world as well as the secular world. But as a Christian, we need to see our primary importance in life is to know God and to live in a way which inspires others to want to know Him. And this includes our spouses, our children, our neighbors, our colleagues, fellow church members, even our enemies, and even the strangers we run into. And I think this is of the utmost importance because a little bit later today we're going to be discussing frontal lobe function and how good are our frontal lobes. They're not a measure of our intelligence, but they're a measure of how we relate to people, even the most difficult people that are in our lives. I used to be a member of Morris Vinden's church in Southern California, and he would frequently say, either at the beginning of his sermons or at the end or somewhere in between, there is no sinner that God does not want in heaven. There is no sin God doesn't hate, and there's no better time than now. And there's really no better time than now to learn about country living, to learn about how to move out of the cities, and before doing that, to spiritually prepare to do that. I've often wondered about the significance of Moses and his 40 years in the country before he led the Israelites out of Egypt. I've often wondered about why did it take the Israelites 40 years in the wilderness, wandering through the wilderness to get to the promised land. And then after talking with people and just thinking about this for a number of years, I've decided that sometimes in the city we pick up so many habits, so many tendencies, a certain way of thinking, that Moses had to be removed from that. He lived in a royal palace, and he needed 40 years in the country. He needed a wife and children, and he needed to tend sheep to get those city tendencies out of him. And so that might be the case with many of us. We have tendencies that we're not even aware of, we don't even think about. Some Bible verses to keep in our minds as we study about country living. I really like 2 Thessalonians 5. And this is something that I think we do need to study. This is where God talks about the coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the truth, that they might be saved. And for this, God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but have pleasure in unrighteousness. And this is a very important concept to understand. A lot of times, we believe such a big lie, such a grand delusion, that we can't even make friends with the truth. And it's important. I think country living helps us reverse engineer the lies that we've learned to believe and we think are true. And when you live in the country, you have time to spend time with God in the morning. I like the habit of 3 times a day spending time in the Bible and reading God's Word, even if it's only a couple minutes. But I think it sets the tone for the rest of the day. Here's another Bible verse in Psalms 85. Surely his salvation is nigh them that fear him, that glory may dwell in our land. Mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. Truth shall spring out of the earth, and righteousness shall look down from heaven. Yea, the Lord shall give that which is good, and our land shall yield her increase. Righteousness shall go before him, and shall set us in the way of his steps. So this series, it's really about people who are living in the city, who are contemplating a move to the country. But it's also for people who maybe recently moved to the country and don't have a lot of experience. And even though I'm the speaker at this seminar, there's going to be a lot of people here that are going to have experience that we're going to learn from and benefit from. So it's not just me, but there's the interaction of me with everyone in the audience. So it's really a lot of fun, I hope, for all of us. So what are your potential reasons for wanting to move to the country? These are important things to think about. Is your motivation, is it internal or is it external? Because people that are being pushed to do something by someone else, if you move because everyone else is doing it, that's pretty weak motivation to do so. And there's a good possibility that it won't work out. So your motivation has to be strong. It has to be internal. And we're going to talk about the spiritual preparation to move to the country, which is so important. So without the spiritual preparation and leading by the Holy Spirit, a move to the country can be difficult, especially if, say, the husband wants to move and the wife isn't quite sure. If you move to the country before you figure that out, that can be a pretty rough situation. So before you move your entire family to the country, the mom and dad need to be pretty much on the same page and have the same desire to move to the country. And we also need to set up landmarks like, okay, let's do some reevaluation, say every 6 months. How are we doing? Is one person enjoying it and loving it and thriving, but is the other person not so happy and maybe getting a little bit depressed and just not understanding all that's required to live in the country? So this is where it helps to have a mentor, someone who's been living in the country for a while. Hook up with them and benefit from their experience. That's really important. Spiritual preparation, though, is essential to being successful. Let's think a little bit. Let's go to the Bible, Genesis 18. We're going to be talking about Abraham and Lot. And Abraham and Lot were relatives. Lot was Abraham's nephew. And they moved around. They were nomadic. But as they moved around the country, they decided it would be good to settle down in one place. And Abraham gave Lot the first choice of where he wanted to settle down. And Lot chose the beautiful valley with the big city in it. And Abraham chose to be outside of the city, more in the country. And if you read Genesis 18 and 19, it's very interesting what happens. So Abraham and Sarah get a visit from they're actually heavenly visitors. And when they visited Abraham and Sarah immediately offered to cook them a meal, and they invited them in and made them comfortable. And it didn't take very long for Abraham to realize these visitors were not from earth. They were heavenly visitors. They were angels. And the angels actually came with a message for Abraham that his wife, they had never had children. She was 90 years old. She was barren. And they came with the message that Sarah would bear a child. And Sarah, upon hearing this, she was probably in a different part of the tent, actually laughed. She couldn't believe that that would actually happen. But what a great promise. So that the heavenly visitors actually told Abraham that his descendants would be without number. And this is one of the most incredible prophecies, I think, or promises in the Bible. Maybe that would be second to Genesis 3:15, where God actually promises Eve that she will bear the son who will bruise the head of the serpent. Even though her heel will be bruised, that was a promise of Christ coming to redeem mankind. And really Genesis 3:15 is the John 3:16 of the Old Testament. So that's also a beautiful promise. But if you want to contrast what happened to Lot, the angels went to visit Lot and his family in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. And as the three men arrived in the city, they were immediately mobbed. And men actuated by evil demons knew the heavenly host were disguised in humanity. And they had come to the city to warn Lot and his family to leave. And Lot, while living in the city, he did try to maintain his religious traditions, but he recognized that these visitors were in great peril. And in the course of their brief visit to the city, God actually had to blind the mob, the unruly crowd outside of Lot's house, or they would have come in the house and would have tried to harm the heavenly visitors. So there's a big difference if we look at the heavenly visitors going to Abraham versus going to Lot, and we see the difference between living in the country and living in the city. And that's just one story. There's many other stories. And at some point in the near future, there may be one last opportunity to leave with your family, but why wait for the last train out? So I think it's really important to make plans. If that's something that the Holy Spirit is inspiring you to do, then you need to make plans to leave the city and not be the last person out. So let's see here. Let's go to 1 Thessalonians 4:15. In God's mercy, not all of us will be alive till the end. So we know that Mrs. White says that God will lay to rest the very old and maybe the very young. And it's easy to rationalize staying in a large city. If you've always lived in the city, it's easy to say, well, I'm just going to take my chances. You know, I have a cabin 2 hours out of the city. I'm going to be able to go to that cabin. But we're told that just as it was in the days of Noah, it is the same before the Son of Man returns. The second coming is a worldwide event. Every eye shall see him. Jesus does not touch the earth, but he gathers his people to him in the clouds. And for this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, shall not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the archangel's call, and with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so shall we always be with the Lord. So this is a promise that whether we die before the Lord comes or whether we're alive when the Lord comes, he has made a place for us in heaven, and we will be redeemed. We will go to heaven, and we will live with Christ forever. So how does that happen? Because we actually have to make some pretty important decisions for Christ. We were given free will. And so every single person who has been alive, who will be born, has to make the choice. We have to choose Christ. And to be able to choose Christ, we actually need to take care of our brain, right? We need to have good brain function. And so I want to cover a little bit about frontal lobes and what it means to be human. And there's 5 important take-home messages that we're going to cover with frontal lobe function. And think about this. An infinitely complex and loving God created us. So because he created us, he made us also complex. We're very complex. And we reflect his glory. So we have an amazing brain, and it's so important to be able to use our brain according to how God designed us, created us, and intended us to use that brain. And that brain was created to connect with God. And everything about our brain and how our brain operates is designed to reflect God, to glorify God, to be drawn to God, to do God's will, and to be God's hands and feet. He's not here on earth. Christ is not on earth anymore. We need to be his hands and feet. And to do that, we need good brain function. And so we're going to talk about 5 different things that can help us with brain function. And so let's talk about how these 5 spiritual aspects affect our frontal lobes. Number 1, the science of salvation encompasses every aspect of our existence, whether it's genetics, molecular biology, medicine, nutrition, language, art, etc. Number 2, we connect with heaven through our frontal lobes. This is the control panel of our humanity. Our frontal lobes can be compromised by a lot of things, including stress. Chronic, unrelenting stress damages our frontal lobes. A poor diet damages our frontal lobes. An inverted circadian rhythm. Maybe you sleep all day and you're up all night. That's an inverted circadian rhythm. Maybe you work as a nurse. You work the night shift. That's an inverted circadian rhythm. That can be damaging to the frontal lobes. Also, certain behaviors can be very damaging. Music, very loud, dissonant type music can damage the frontal lobes. Computer games, turn your frontal lobes off like that. TV, same thing, off they go. You can have an accident, be in a car accident, a motorcycle accident, and hit your head, hit your frontal lobes. That can damage your frontal lobes. Toxins, environmental toxins. There's hundreds of thousands of toxins out there. And we come into contact maybe with 5,000 to 10,000 toxins on a regular basis. Those toxins can damage our frontal lobes if we have a lot of exposure. And we're going to talk about that on a different day. Chronic degenerative diseases can also damage our frontal lobes. And we're not going to talk too much about that, but things like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, those can damage and impact the frontal lobes. Number 3, the Bible identifies those who are Christians as sealed in their foreheads. And this is so interesting, sealed in the foreheads and in our hands. And the frontal lobe area, according to the Bible, is the seat of our spirituality. And our hands they illustrate how we help other people. We use our hands to give someone a hand up. We use our hands to feed another person, to help them upstairs. So our forehead and our hands are very important. We're going to talk more about that. Also, the brain is the most highly metabolic region of the body. It needs a constant supply of glucose and oxygen, nutrients, and also voltage. So we're going to talk about the best way to nourish our frontal lobes. Number 5, good brain functions translate into health, equanimity, gratitude, good choices, vitality, spirituality, a servant mentality, and many other traits. So good frontal lobe function actually sets us up to have an amazing life. And this life is with God. It's not apart from God, but it's with God. And that does require good frontal lobe function. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But I want to talk about the flip side of frontal lobes and how they can be used for bad. And most of us have read about World War II and what went on in Germany and surrounding countries during World War II at the concentration camps. And a lot of people alive at that time wondered, how could that happen? How could people be so inhumane to their fellow man? A lot of us just, it's hard to comprehend being that evil. And so a researcher named Stanley Milgram decided to design some experiments. This happened about 10 or 15 years after World War II ended. And he designed this experiment to see if he could just pull people off the street and put them in a setting where they would punish another human being. And how far would they be willing to go to punish that person? And would they be willing to deliver a lethal option? And so these experiments were designed and they were done. And what happened is he would recruit people off the street into a lab, and there would be a room with someone sitting in a chair that was hooked up to electricity. And there would be a one-way mirror. So the experimenters and researchers could be looking at the person sitting in the chair, but that person couldn't see the researchers. Now, unbeknownst to the people that he pulled off the street, the person sitting in the chair was an actor. And they were not actually receiving electrical shocks during the experiment, but they acted like they were receiving the electrical shocks. And so to set this up, as the experiments went forward, there was a researcher wearing a white lab coat and a nice name tag and a big title. And the person they recruited off the street was told that every time the person in the electric chair answered a question wrong, they were to deliver a shock. And each time they got a wrong answer, the dose of the shock would increase. It would be a greater and greater shock. Okay, so each time the actor got the question wrong, the participant was supposed to shock them, and the actor would act like they had been shocked. And the shocks got greater and greater and greater. And at the very end of the continuum of shocks here was a lethal shock. Okay, so I'm sure you're thinking right now that no one got the lethal shock, right? This is 15 years after World War II, so it was not like it just happened. I mean, it was not like it was way in the past. But interestingly enough, we find that 65% of the participants who were recruited off the street into the lab were willing to deliver a lethal shock. So even in some cases, the participant actually wanted to stop. They didn't want to keep delivering the shocks. But the researcher prodded them and would push them. Oh, you can do it. You can do it. It's okay. This is a bad person. But they reluctantly complied. So something that we thought would never happen again. We never thought World War II, the concentration camps, we never thought they would be a possibility again. But Stanley Milgram proved otherwise. And interestingly enough, he did follow-up experiments. He was so, to use the word shocked, he was so surprised by the results of his experiments that he repeated them. And the subsequent experiments found that 28 all the way up to 91% of the participants were willing to deliver a lethal shock. So these are things to think about. There's also a Stanford prison experiment. If you want to read about that, you can go to Wikipedia and read about it. So what did the Stanley Milgram experiments say about our frontal lobe function? Which person would you be? Would you deliver the lethal shock or would you refuse to do it? And by the way, the participants were given $4 to do the research, to be part of this study. So for $4, which is about the equivalent of $35 today, for $4, these people were willing to deliver, a good percentage were willing to deliver a lethal shock. So which one would we be? And this is really a good question. So who is our authority? As a Christian, is my authority source my pastor? Is it a spouse? Is it my employer, my boss? Is it my children? Do I listen to my children? Who is our authority? And I think most of us are going to answer, God is our authority. Jesus is our authority. And did God ever take away our free will? Has he ever removed that from us? He never has. So we are given free will. But to me, the Stanley Milgram experiments indicate that a lot of Americans have poor frontal lobe function. That's what it says to me. So, there's just a lot of questions you can ask. What if the subject is a different nationality? What if they're a different color? What if they're a prisoner? What if they are a murderer? Are we still willing to deliver that lethal shock? So it tells us a lot about ourselves as we think about these issues. So the question I want to ask is, are we cooperating with God? And a lot of us are going to say, of course I'm cooperating with God. I'm a Christian. But how do we cooperate with God? That's really maybe the better question. And how do we know we are cooperating with God and not just doing what we want to do? These are some important questions. And so when we make choices that protect our frontal lobes, we participate in this amazing experience known as a life with God. So living a life with God, it's not always easy. We know many people have lost their lives because they chose to follow God. But it also offers so many rewards that I think a life with God is probably the most beautiful experience we can have. And for some of us, I'm a 5th generation Adventist. It doesn't mean I've been a Christian my whole life, but it means that every single day I can choose to cooperate with God or to do my own thing. And so in that sense, every day we can choose to be with God or we can choose otherwise. So let's keep going here. I do want to talk about something that's happened fairly recently. I'm not going to say his name, but there was a pretty amazing Christian apologist who had a huge impact in my life. I've listened to a lot of his sermons. And right before he died, it came out that he had done some immoral things. I'm assuming that they were true. And I was really shocked at how many pastors came out and disavowed him. And it still just amazes me. So just because someone makes a moral slip doesn't mean that they won't be in heaven. I don't know if he made himself right with God before he died, but as a Christian, I'm not going to dogpile on him, especially after this person has died. I think the willingness to discredit and dehumanize another person that's fallen is a sign of poor frontal lobe function. And so while we need to have sympathy for the victims, that doesn't preclude also not dehumanizing the other person. And it kind of made me think about the time where the woman caught in adultery was brought to the temple and the priest, and they were going to stone her. And Christ was present. And he leaned down and started writing something in the sand. And as the priest and the rabbis, I guess the rabbis, came to see what he was writing in the sand, they recognized their own sin. And as they looked at that, oh, he's talking about me. I'm out of here. And one by one, each rabbi left. And at the very end, Christ turned to the woman and he said, well, where are your accusers? And she looked around and she said, there are none. And Christ said to her, "Neither do I accuse you. Go and sin no more." And I think that needs to be our message today. Satan has such a stronghold on so many Christians. There's a hidden sin. There's so many things that we don't want to give to Christ. And yet, those sins, maybe as small as they might be, when someone has a much bigger sin and a more obvious sin, we're just willing to jump all over that person, not realizing that we also have sin in our lives. And I think the admonition to go and sin no more is so beautiful, because every day we can start all over. His mercies are new every day, every morning. And so it gives all of us hope that we can live a life with God, and that our frontal lobes can help us do that, and that we can be his hands and feet. When you are tempted to virtue signal your goodness, which your goodness is nothing more than filthy rags. My goodness, nothing more than filthy rags. When you're tempted to gaslight another person, remember the verse, Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." So it's very important to not get into arguments necessarily and criticize other people. And I fall short of this. I'm not a perfect person, but I do like Jude 9. And Jude 9 describes Christ coming down to the earth to claim the body of Moses. But Satan says, "No, you can't have him. He sinned." And instead of Christ arguing with the devil, he said, "The Lord rebuke you. The Lord rebuke you." So, and remember Eve in the Garden of Eden, where she had the conversation with the serpent? If she had never gotten into that conversation in the first place and said, "The Lord rebuke you," we would not be here on this earth. We would be in heaven.
To be aware of new videos like this one, be sure to subscribe to the Preparing for the Time of Trouble channel. For more free videos and downloadable audio podcasts, as well as handouts, go to www.preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com. Topic categories include recordings of live seminar presentations, country living, sustainable gardening, homestead remedies, how to be self-sufficient when the grid goes down, wild edible and medicinal plants, hydrotherapy, and end-time Bible prophecies. To take advantage of these free resources, go to preparingforthetimeoftrouble.com.